Yo, how's it going everybody? It's Sketch and welcome back to the channel and welcome to the month of October where we'll be covering some more spooky and horror themed games. On today's episode we're taking a look at A Nightmare on Elm Street for the NES, developed by Rare and published by LJN in 1990. Loosely based on the first three films, it does some things moderately well while doing others maybe not as great as they could have. Of the NES catalog, this is a fairly polarizing game since some people like this one a lot and others don't like it at all, both with valid reasons. Nightmare on Elm Street, however, does have some unique traits to it as well as some interesting bits as to where it almost went during its development. Though before we get into all that, let's check out the story real quick. Day after day on Elm Street, another gruesome scene plays out as another midnight attack claims yet another victim. While some believe it's natural causes, you and your friends know the truth and set out to battle the infamous Freddy Krueger, trademark. Through 7 stages, you'll gather and burn the bones of Freddy and send him back into the Shadow Realm. At a base, sounds real simple, right? But upon hitting start, you'll soon realize the hefty task you have in front of you. Gameplay-wise, this platformer has some greasy controls. While it'll do most of what you want it to do most of the time, be prepared for some strange delays on actions, especially if you button bash in a panic. Getting used to the floaty controls and slight delay of the character's punch is essential to making progress while not taking too much damage. The game starts you out on the left side of Elm Street without much explanation. The goal here is to find the accessible houses and gather the bones throughout each. The first 3 stages are always randomized as far as which house comes first and which order the remaining ones will fall into, while the last 4 stages are always in the same order, ending at Elm Street High School. It might be a rare occasion, but on the run I got a clear on this game, all the houses fell into a straight line from left to right, which was pretty interesting. You'll punch, shoot, and dodge an assortment of fairly stock horror themed enemies, mainly bats, flies, and shambling zombies, coupled with some very challenging platforming, especially towards the latter end of the game. Many of these jumps as your base character will seem impossible, and that's because they probably are, without some extreme luck at times. Nightmare on Elm Street uses a mechanic while in the collection stages of going back and forth between the reality and dream state. In the regular world, your character can collect the bones and make most jumps without assistance, whereas in the dream state, you can select 3 additional characters, being the Acrobat, Shadow Warrior, or the Necromancer, each with their own special abilities and projectiles. These characters can be used in the dream state, and boss fights only is the catch though. Enemies in the real world and dream state also have some differences, being their appearances or in some cases full-on sprite swaps with increased health. There's also cups of coffee to increase your sleep meter to help you stay awake, and boom boxes to wake you up if you're in the dream state too long as you return to reality. Once the bones are collected in each area, you can progress to the next, which will be another section of the same with some added hazards and sometimes enemies in often much tighter spaces. Once the second set is retrieved, you'll head to a boss encounter, which honestly is one of the game's main mix bags. You'll see several reused sprites from other encounters, just used in slightly different ways. Granted, the attack patterns will switch up slightly. The second half of the game essentially has the same boss fight 3 times consecutively while only changing the sprite itself. You start with a base of 5 lives, and after each boss encounter you'll get a key for the next location and an extra life. Once you burn those stocks, you have 3 continues, but once those are gone, it's game over. The platforming and figuring out enemy hitboxes is going to be the main reason you'll die constantly. This is a good example of a game you likely will not clear right away, considering how it plays and what approach is most effective. There's also sections of some stages that require using a special character, otherwise making it nearly impossible without taking a lot of damage, losing a life, or even several if you're really unlucky. Graphics wise, this honestly isn't too bad in this regard and has some decent enemy and level designs. Upon starting the game, you can tell it's a Rareware game with its visual aesthetic. With this title being one of the few that can support up to 4 players simultaneously, there can be a lot happening on screen at any given moment. Elm Street functions as a hub world with various hazards and familiar locales based on the source material, like the junkyard, cemetery, and the staple feature Elm Street High. Enemies will pretty much be on screen from jump and might leave you with little to no time to react. Enemies will also often pop up in spots either in formation like the bats and snakes on the ground that slink along your path, and a lot of shambling zombies and skeletons. Even in the hub world, there are a few hazards that can smoke you, like the razors and the falling boulders. Going through each stage, backgrounds are actually pretty colorful with a decent amount of detail, all things considered, and the visual cues definitely lean into British platformer aesthetic. Level designs revolve around the bone collecting, and here is where it gets pretty tricky with some of the locations. There are parts where the bones blend in with its surroundings, and they will be very easy to miss. Figuring out where they are and the best order to grab them them in is going to be essential. The early stages are somewhat straightforward with where they'll be placed, though the further in you get, they'll be in some really tough spots. Getting all the Dream Warrior upgrades will help tremendously in game, allowing for ranged attacks and improved jumping abilities. Be prepared for a lot of pits and platforming that can border on frustrating, since it's chock full of beginner's traps that can and will get you on the first few times around. Bosses are an interesting case here, considering depending on perspective is either adequate or a potential missed opportunity as far as things that could have been pulled from the films. The first iteration of Freddy will be his razor glove on some balls that will go across the screen at various distances. The following boss will be Freddy's head, also on, you guessed it, a chain of balls that spits tongues at you, which is a decent callback to the films, granted. The next three bosses, however, is where, again, these encounters are all very similar since the attack pattern is the same, just with a swap sprite. The Glove, Bat Fred, and Ghost Freddy all fly around the screen with similar trajectory, which again can either be seen as lazy, average, or awesome. Stage 6 runs back 2 encounters from the first and second stage, except now they can free roam around the screen and are on the board at the same time, which can get hectic. Finally, if you can make it to the end, is the final fight with Freddy himself, which is hot off the heels of a boss rush of every previous boss you've seen so far. Here's the funny part about the final fight though. In the earlier stages, if your sleep meter depletes and you are still in the dream state too long, this will trigger a short battle with Freddy, where once you knock his health down, he'll jump off screen, and surprise, once you get to the end of the game, it's the exact same encounter. During the boss fights though, it's encouraged to use one of the Dream Warriors and not the base character, because the range attacks will make these encounters much easier. Sound wise, this is probably one of Nightmare on Elm Street's strongest points, being its soundtrack, which actually has a few jams in there. The Junkyard tune sounds like something from the 1970s Dawn of the Dead, with its heavy goblin-esque vibe. Music wise, it's got all the familiar traits from previous Rare titles, all often having strong soundtracks, and here is no different. The overall theme is also a low-key belter, along with a couple of the other level tunes. Sound effects wise, however, it's fairly standard. There's a lot of spots where you'd expect something to have a sound of action, and it just doesn't. Picking up items and defeating enemies all have audio cues, but that's about it really. While the soundtrack has some high points, the rest of the audio again is kinda mid here, to be fair. There's also a few points from when the game was in its development and almost went an entirely different direction. Had they went this route, could have been really interesting. In early versions, players would have been able to don the role of Freddy Krueger himself, invading dreams and murking the kids of Elm Street, but was later changed to the response of how the Halloween and Texas Chainsaw Massacre Atari games went just a few years prior, with those being one of the few games where you play as the villain. Had Nintendo allowed Rare to do the game in this way, that could have been really cool compared to what ended up being released. Overall, Nightmare on Elm Street is an interesting case. While this has a lot of potential to be a great horror platformer for the NES, depending on perspective is going to determine how much enjoyment you'll get out of this one. For fans of the franchise, this could be a nice collector's piece, or for horror buffs, since this is one of the few appearances of Freddy Krueger in video games besides his cameos in the later entries of the Mortal Kombat series. This is also a game, depending on your level of patience, can be an exercise in frustration. There's a lot about this game that could have been awesome, but compared to other horror franchises that are also on the NES, aside from its novelty, it falls a bit flat. Not trying to say you can't enjoy this one, especially if you use the 4-player function, but this one just isn't hitting that hard. While it's a relatively short game, once you get through it, that won't come without getting smoked upwards of a few hundred times by some slippery controls, at times unfair enemy placements, and a slew of beginner's traps. Plus, if that weren't enough, the ending once you get there is fucking cheeks. It sticks to the source material to an extent, narrative wise, but for the levels of frustration you'll experience, it borders on not worth it. Also, considering what this cart goes for loose these days, I'd recommend several other games before this one. Nightmare on Elm Street gets a 6.5 out of 10, and I'd only recommend this to fans of the franchise who want an interesting collector's piece, and those who have a lot of patience with platform games, since it's doubtful you'll clear this one on the first few attempts. While it's not the most difficult game ever, it's got a lot of cheap mechanics that will inflate the difficulty quite a bit. Not to say that you can't have fun with this one, but for the price it goes for, it's not quite worth the squeeze, I'd say. But hey man, if you're curious, play it however you can, or if you can get it for a deal. And I thank you again for checking out this video. If you find these videos helpful, that's awesome. I'm glad you can use it as a resource. Check back often. We'll have more reviews and commentaries coming up in the near future, but until then, take it easy, stay safe out there, and I'll see you on the next one.